Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to have a look at the unsung heroes of the 41st millennium. The poor bastards who get even less of the credit than the God Emperor's Imperial Guard, namely his Planetary Defense Forces, or PDF for short. And man, do they really not get the credit that they deserve? As usually, when you hear about the PDF, it is as the butt of some joke, or news of their near immediate annihilation at the hands of the enemy, or perhaps most insultingly of all, it is usually the PDF that becomes the enemy, falling prey to chaos or gene-stealer infestations, or just simply simping for that big booty Tau GF. And even in the most charitable of interpretations, the PDF's task is little more than to make the Guard look good, either by saving their yokel asses from the fire, or by showing off all the fancy Imperial Guard toys they have, like personal vox beads or sparkly las weaponry. Meanwhile, the PDF will be lucky if they get an auto gun, or a bolt-action rifle, or a massive backpack-carried voxcaster that weighs about as much as the guy forced to hump it around the field. And yet, as the Guard is to the Astartes, the PDF is to the Guard. They may not receive much in the way of credit, and there certainly are nowhere near as many songs and legends and books written about them, but without local defense forces, the Imperium would collapse. There would be no one to fight off pirates, raiders, small chaos cultists, or to simply maintain public order in trying times. As much as the Astartes are the sword, and the Imperial Guard the shield, the PDF is the glue, without whom the entire fabric of Imperial society would simply collapse into lawlessness and anarchy. For it is the PDF, at the end of the day, that enforces the Imperium's authority across countless millions of worlds. And not in a legalistic sense, mind you. Obviously, enforcing local law is the jurisdiction and the responsibility of local law enforcement, and occasionally the Adeptus Arbites making sure that the spirit of Imperial law supersedes all. No, the PDF is instead authority, and represents the government's absolute monopoly on violence. At least in theory, as there are certainly many Imperial worlds where there are significant percentages of the population that endeavour to challenge aforementioned monopoly. But that merely means that your PDF isn't large enough. Not to mention, of course, the occasional presence of significant external forces, also looking to question that monopoly. Pirates, raiders, chaos cultists, tyrannid cultists, invasion forces, splinters of fleeing defeated main-strength enemies, be they the remnants of chaos fleets or tyrannid splinter fleets. There is a myriad of threats lurking out there in the cold darkness of the vast empty expanses of the 41st millennium's void. And the Imperial Guard, for all their countless billions, simply can't be everywhere at once. But the PDF, through simple virtue of being the local defense force, well, they can. And so will stand ready to meet any foe and any threat at any time. Though they do so in a wide variety of ways, and to a wildly differing degree of capability. But before we get into the literally unlimited number of different PDF formations in terms of equipment, organization, leadership style, and tasks, let's again reaffirm what the PDF is there for. Their first and foremost task is to maintain imperial governance. And the second task, spawned from that task, is to defend the planet against hostile threats, external as well as internal. These two tasks determine broadly the capabilities that the PDF must have, regardless of its type or organization or equipment or yada 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 yada. Fortunately, the two tasks share a great deal of similarities. It's just usually the difficulty of achieving those tasks that tend to be the separating factor, as most obviously what a PDF requires is military might, pure and simple. And virtually every other concern comes secondary to this requirement. For again, there are absolutely worlds on which the PDF's tasks are significantly more diverse than simply being the biggest bully boys on the blocks. On some planets, they will have a policing role, making sure that the laws are followed. They might be there to keep up morale amongst the populace. They might be toy soldiers whose near sole duty is to remind the people of a glorious past, to parade past them in beautiful uniforms. There might be worlds where the PDF is little more than an irregular and occasionally raised militia, where the soldiers the rest of the time simply work alongside the rest of the populace, and so on and so on. But military might, first and foremost, is always the main requirement. Even in the case of the pretty toy soldiers, they're going to be equipped far better than the average civilian, or gang member, or organized criminal, as there's the problem with many a world in the 41st millennium. The external threats are of course dangerous, and we'll get to those in a moment, but the internal ones can often be just as bad. Imagine a hive world, for example. The average hive is going to have literally, actually, millions of hardened career criminals armed to the teeth living in the underhives. Luckily, the vast majority of these underhives are further subdivided into hundreds, if not thousands, of warring gangs, clans, tribes, cults, you name it. So they will rarely, if ever, pose any actual threat to the middle or the upper hive. Usually it's more than enough for the Adeptus Arbites to send down a little bit of a raid now and then to cull their numbers, or kill any gang leader that's getting a little bit too influential. But there is always the possibility, no matter how minute, that all of those downtrodden and heavily armed masses might one day look up and think, there's an awful lot of us. And those towers do look damn shiny from down here. In which case, local law enforcement and a few thousand Arbites are not gonna be enough. What you need is an army, and the PDF provides, though even then, it is often not enough. There are many worlds in the 41st millennium that exist in a perpetual state of civil war, which the Imperium really actually doesn't care over much about. Many worlds fight wars and finish them without the Imperium ever getting involved or ever wanting to get involved. Sometimes these can be minor local disputes. Say, for example, a particularly tyrannical local governor that is elected to crack down on his people's privileges with armed force. So long as the people don't actually get back in control or anything, and the tithes continue to get paid, the Imperium isn't going to care over much. On occasion, it might be the other way around, where the populace will rise up and overthrow their oppressors. This tends to be the point at which the Imperium does get involved, because, well, killing the local governor leads to a bit of an interruption in governance, as I'm sure you can imagine. Though, even then, if the planet can get back on its feet rapidly enough and continue to offer up the ties that the Imperial want, well, they'll simply just change the name of the person responsible. And in some cases, outright states of planetary warfare can exist for decades at a time, with entire local nations waging near unending war upon one another, for territory, for power, for some ancient feud or whatever. This is the battleground of the Planetary Defense Force. And so long as the Imperium is not overly inconvenienced, it will simply stay out of it. Now, as for the capabilities of the PDF, it does often depend on the world in question and the scale of the threat that it is expected to face. If a planet is far behind any currently active lines of combat, for example, then the worst thing that they are likely to have to face off against is organized gangs. Now that can be bad enough, as you might very well have an entire population's worth of guerrilla fighters constantly rising up against the governor, requiring continuous suppression operations, but they're likely to be relatively lightly armed. Solid slug weaponry, auto guns, maybe some stubbers here and there, or the very occasional las weapon. In which case, all the PDF is going to need for local force superiority is a handful of old battered APCs, and maybe a couple tanks, produced either from a local forge world or potentially even locally sourced, as there are many worlds who produce their own war gear. Now, this is not sanctioned, necessarily, but neither are there any laws against it. If a planet wishes to produce a tank, then go ahead. Nobody's going to stop them. And most planets aren't going to have the technology required to make a decent armored vehicle anyway. Though I admit this is where one of the inconsistencies of the 41st millennium does rear its ugly head. Because if we have a large-scale war that's been raging on a planet for a significant amount of time, then naturally both sides will be attempting to develop an edge in this war, be it by developing new tactics, new weaponry, new machines, etc. This is simply just how humanity has always functioned. Now, obviously, there have been extraordinarily long periods of time where very little innovation has actually happened, but if this world is on the level of, say, World War I, for example, then building an armored vehicle is absolutely well within their grasps. Of course, the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Tex Priests are going to keep a very tight rein on most forms of technology, indeed damn near all forms of technology. But if this war drags on for long enough, it seems very weird that the locals wouldn't figure out how to make bigger and better tanks eventually. Hell, considering the explosive technological development that we have seen in our own timeline whenever there was a world war on, it seems very unlikely that a planet wouldn't actually come up with something quite intriguing given a decade or two of conflict. But this is a point a little bit beyond the remits of what we are currently discussing, as usually these PDF forces will be equipped with either, if they're very lucky, guard surplus machinery, ancient chimeras or scout salamanders, maybe even the occasional battered to shitten back Lehman Russ. But usually they will be provided with non-Imperial Guard standard equipment, as there are actually several different patterns of tanks, of artillery pieces, of APCs and IFVs available throughout the Imperium. These are the locally produced staples of many a forge world, but since they are not up to Imperial Guard standard, they are not actually provided to the Guard unless there are particularly extenuating circumstances or points of preference. Many an Imperial Guard regiment, for example, is very picky about their las guns. Most will be issued with the good old-fashioned triplex pattern, but take the Elysian drop troopers, for example. Due to the nature of their specialization, they have developed the Akatran pattern Mark IV lasgun, a bullpup-style variant. Meanwhile, the Death Corps of Krieg, of course, prefer the Lucius pattern number 98. Now, PDF troops are rarely, if ever, given this degree of preferential treatment, obviously, but this still means that there is a great deal of shall we say, off-brand weaponry scattered throughout the Imperium. One example of an actual tank like this would be the AT-70 Reaver battle tank found in the Sabbat worlds, produced on the Forge world of Urdesh, and fielded in significant numbers by the Chaos cultists who happened to take over the planet. Still, this would absolutely be a locally produced pattern of tank that might be issued either to local Imperial Guard regiments if enough Leman Russes were not available, and definitely to local PDF forces. And though something like the AT-70 is inferior to the full-on standard pattern Leman Russ, it is obviously still a massive advantage over lower hives scumsuckers. But that's hardly a very high hurdle to clear either. In fact, many worlds like this, where the greatest danger is essentially organized criminals, will turn to the criminals themselves to source their planetary defense forces. Again, if you're not expecting to be invaded from the outside world, and your main concern is the maintenance of Imperial rule on the planet, well, you might as well cheap out on it a little bit. And if you can get the local warlords to provide you with your army for free, or at the very least far cheaper than the Administratum, why not do so? There are even, of course, example planets that are not ruled directly by a single governor, but something closer to councils. And in the case of an extraordinarily crime-infested hive-world planet, well, a gang of criminals all agreeing upon general policy is just as effective as a governor, right? At least as far as the Imperium is concerned, as long as the tithes, yet again, keep flowing. And this isn't even the most low-tech form of PDF you could see. You might think that, officially state-governed and sponsored gangsters would be about as low as it gets. Not at all. There are feral worlds in the Imperium, there are feudal worlds, where the local governor might raise militias of literally spear-wielding maniacs, or people armed primarily with swords or cudgels. Even this actual medieval mob could be a PDF. Now, there will usually be a hard nucleus, an elite core surrounding the governor himself, who will have access to relatively modern quote-unquote weaponry, autoguns at least, or preferably a few las weapons, and they will be more than enough to keep order on a feudal planet. 100 las men will turn back damn near any number of peasants with pitchforks after all. But, just like the Imperial Guard can't be everywhere, those 100 honor guards of the governor can't cover an entire planet. And so, yet again, the PDF medieval edition is required. And so long as that's good enough, then, well, it's good enough. Simple as. You don't need squadrons of Chimera APCs if a bunch of dudes on horses will do the job. Of course, this is not always going to be the case, as if you are in an area where external threats, or internal ones of a more persistent and hostile nature, are present, a bunch of dudes with swords probably aren't going to work anymore. Say you are on a planet with a long and dubious history of chaos corruption. You're going to want to maintain a significant PDF force to be able to counter any chaos cultist activity. Or maybe we're talking about a planet that once upon a time suffered an orc invasion. See, the issue with orcs is that even after you've defeated them and eradicated them, they still stick around. As even the tiniest quantity of spores can persist in almost any environment and give rise to new hordes of greenskins. The planet Valhalla, the famous ice world that is the home of the Valhallan Ice Warriors, is still plagued with occasional bursts of greenskin violence to this day, and the Valhallans did a pretty thorough job of cleansing them the first time around. In these cases, the PDF forces need to be a great deal more substantial, probably in terms of simple numbers rather than equipment. If you've got a low-level but consistent threat like these, what you need is essentially a larger and more heavily armed police force. Vast bodies of men capable of carrying out patrols and punishment expeditions into, say, the lower levels of underhives, or into deep jungles, or into vast ice wastes. You'll still be able to make do with good old-fashioned autoguns, or even bolt-action rifles, and occasionally a bit of transportation equipment, trucks or APCs or scout salamanders, maybe some light armored vehicles, but what you need first and foremost is bodies. These planets tend to have PDFs that make up a fairly significant portion of the total population of the world, making them ideal recruiting worlds for the Imperial Guard as well. Valhalla, yet again, is an excellent example of this. After the Valhallans defeated the Orcs, they realized that, well, first, to fight the Orcs to begin with, they needed a large and self-created army. And after they beat them, well, the Orcs never really went away. And so they kept raising PDF regiments. And since the Imperium is always in need of fighting men, it looked at Valhalla and went, well, you seem to be getting a large quantity of fighting men there, and you don't seem to have anything of value really to pay the tithe with, so how about we make a deal? Every few decades or so, you scrape off the cream off the crop, the best of the best, and you form a handful of regiments for us. Simple. Elegant, even. Allowing even a harsh, damn near uninhabitable ice world to contribute to the Imperium. And on particularly lucky occasions, they might even get a package deal. As with the Valhallans, once again, they provide fighting men that are extraordinarily hardy and capable in Arctic conditions. They also export, of course, their unique greatcoats, heated and specially insulated to provide warmth in even the most ridiculously of cold environments. Now, as a Norwegian, I feel honor bound yet again to point out that what you'd really want in extreme cold conditions is layered clothing of good old-fashioned jackets and pants rather than a greatcoat, which tends to be somewhat breezy, but hey, the Valhallans were, at the end of the day, designed by a bunch of British people, a race who is famed far and wide for the fact that they panic and think the sky is falling when the roads get covered in an inch of snow. So, you know, details. But it goes quite some distance to prove that the PDF can produce quality, and often does. In fact, on some worlds, the PDF is considered so prized that they are not allowed to be used for Imperial Guard recruitment. Rather, the PDF is maintained as a permanent, high-readiness, high-efficiency standing army. Such was the case with the Vervan Primary of the world of Verghast. The Vervan Primary were not only equipped with lasguns, but also with entire regiments of Imperial Guard standard Lehman Russers. They even had their own local version of the Commissariat. And, of course, they were ensconced behind enormous curtain walls, and they were possessed of tremendous artillery capabilities. The Vervan Primary would be the equal of near any Imperial Guard formation in all but experience. Granted, this is by far the rarest of PDF troops, as usually the best of the best, like with the Valhallans, are recruited into the Guard as an understanding with the rest of the Imperium, as is the case with the Maccabian militia, where the finest soldiers are recruited, and it is viewed as a tremendous honor to be recruited into the Maccabian Janissaries, a very powerful and renowned Imperial Guard regiment. And this, incidentally, really is the greatest and most honorable duty and tradition of the Planetary Defense Forces, as they can actually trace their history all the way back to a point preceding that of the Imperial Guard, or even the Imperial Army, as they were called during the Great Crusade. as the very first planetary defense forces, well, they were none other than Terra's defense forces, the so-called Old 100 regiments that fought alongside the God Emperor and his Thunder Warriors to conquer Terra. They also then left the planet alongside the Emperor to begin the conquest of the Imperium. But they were, in essence, initially PDF formations. Many of them even returned to being PDF formations, as several of these regiments were granted settlement rights on conquered planets. This is a process through which particularly accomplished and honoured regiments are granted the privilege of disbanding on a world and then intermingle with the civilian populace, becoming the new owners of that world, making it their new homeworld, in fact. And thus the regiment would have returned to its old position as a planetary defense force. Not all of the original 100 regiments, however, were so rewarded. Many were considered too effective, too good, or in some cases too damaged or dangerous to be granted this ultimate reward. And a handful even exist all the way into the modern-day 41st millennium, as regiments of incredible pedigree and renown, few and far in between though they might be. These more elite PDF formations that eventually become elite Imperial Guard regiments tend to be the result of worlds with either a very long history of high-level violence, like Krieg, for example, the homeworld of the Death Corps, a world that decided to secede from the Imperium, but was stopped from doing so quite brutally by a commissar who decided the best way to halt the rebellion was to dump the world's nuclear arsenal on top of the rebels. And to his credit, it worked. It absolutely did. It reduced their numbers to the point where the loyalists could fight back. And after many, many years of grueling warfare, Krieg was an Imperial world yet again, with a lot of spare regiments to send off into space. Other planets might have exceptional circumstances or specializations. The Elysian Drop Troopers, for example. Incidentally, I've done lore videos on most of these regiments already in case you want to look into them, but in the case of Elysia, it is a world that is very, very high above, very tall, and as so using grav chutes to travel around is entirely common, giving the people of Elysia a near unique mastery of the grav chute and a fantastic head for heights. Add in extensive training and expertise in the specialist form of warfare required to operate in close consort with heavy gunships, and you've got the makings of an elite regiment. You might even have PDF formations that are closer to the Vervan primary, but not quite so entrenched. Far more elite than your average PDF, but not quite so dedicated, shall we say. This would be, for example, the Agrippina PDF. They, due to their proximity to the Eye of Terror, of course, need to be at a far higher level of readiness than pretty much any other PDF formation throughout the galaxy. Thus, they too are equipped with their own tanks. They even produce their own specialty vehicle, the Lehman Russ Eradicator, with a locally manufactured pattern of its main battery Nova cannon. Nevertheless, they remain decidedly a PDF formation, and due to the focus on getting lasguns out to the regular guard regiments, they are in turn equipped with a simple autogun, the Agrippina Type 2. Now, it's a locally produced mark and probably superior to most autoguns, but it is, nevertheless, just a good old-fashioned solid slug weapon. But the vast majority of PDF formations, of course, won't be anything quite so fancy or unique. They won't have a big mission like protecting the Imperium from the Eye of Terror. They won't be elite troops like the Elysians. They're probably not even going to have any particularly marketable skills like the Valhallans. The vast majority of PDF regiments are going to be equipped with locally produced weaponry. Bolt-action rifles, in some cases single-shot lasslocks, outright muskets, or locally produced autoguns, whatever can be made cheaply and easily on the world in question. Their uniforms will be nothing fancy, unlike the Vervun primary. Their task will be simple, to maintain control over a world in the God Emperor's name. And their daily jobs? Drudgery. Patrols, exercises, endless trainings for a war that, in all due likelihood, will never come. And in terms of fancy stuff like armor, or even more fancy, an air force, well, they're gonna have something old, probably home-produced. There's even mention of a world in Double Eagle that use so-called wolf cubs, which sound an awful lot like the ME-163 from our own history. Which, if that's true, then that is a tragic little vehicle indeed. And when deployed, the PDF is more likely to be fighting against their own Imperial citizens than invading Chaos Forces, or Tyranids, or Tau, or Dark Eldar, or anything else. They're most likely to be putting down civilian uprisings, unrests, quelling food riots, or if things get very, very interesting, maybe destroying a local chaos commune of a couple hundred members. And, still, seeming insignificance of their task notwithstanding, the PDF are the bedrock of the Imperium. So the next time you're reading about the glorious exploits of the Imperial Guard or the Adeptus Astartes, spare a thought for the PDF as well. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.